IV's daughters, and he was even made Richard's heir at one time. He survived Richard's reign quite happily, and of course, immediately after Bosworth, he was put in the Tower of London by Henry Tudor and judicially murdered some years later. So we do know what happened to one nephew who had a very good claim to the throne, as good as the two princes, once they'd been declared illegitimate.
Well then, what do you say about the pressure, inevitable pressure, as the prosecution like to describe it, upon Richard to kill the princes, because if they stayed alive, those nephews, they were a threat to Richard?
Of course, they were some kind of a threat to him, but when he was the crowned and anointed king, he was home and dry on the 6th of July, 1483, when everybody accepts that the boys were still alive. You see, the overseas chronicles, the French, there is the assumption that he had to kill the boys in order to become king, but he didn't. He became king while the boys were still alive. And it was in Richard's interest, in my view, to keep the boys alive. They were much more of an embarrassment to Henry Tudor and to Buckingham if Buckingham was aiming to the throne. Well, and it is hypocritical of Henry Tudor to shed tears over the boys. If Henry Tudor had beaten Richard, he would have had to have killed the boys. Otherwise, he would not have been accepted as king.
Because they stood in his way?
Yes.
But the same is true of Buckingham. So let us concentrate for a moment, if we may, upon Buckingham. He had a good and direct title, as we can see from the little chart that the jury have already got. We know that he'd got his eyes on the crown because the chroniclers tell us, and that's been agreed in cross-examination. Can I follow the chronology immediately after the coronation, please? Because Richard and the Queen left London first, leaving Buckingham behind. Am I right in thinking that it wasn't until Richard and the Queen reached Gloucester, where they were between the 29th of July and the 2nd of August, that Buckingham joined them there, stayed for a short time, and then went straight on to Brecon to his estates in Wales? That's the order of events, I think.
Yes.
At Brecon at that time was Bishop Morton detained. That is the man who later became Archbishop of England and in whose household More was brought up. The chroniclers describe Buckingham and Morton's conversation, and indeed it's right to say, even in the old-fashioned edition that I've got of More, the More history of Richard breaks off during their conversation, which began soon after, according to More, who might have known about this fact at any rate, soon after Buckingham arrived there.
Yes, I mean, may I say something about Buckingham's not being with Richard on the royal progress? Buckingham had the opportunity at that point to kill the princes. Yes. He was the Constable of England. Brackenbury, who was the Lieutenant of the Tower, could not have denied him entry. There were many stories going on for many years about what had happened to the princes, and Buckingham is mentioned in 4 or 5 chronicles as a possible murderer. Now, I wouldn't want to accuse Buckingham of the murder any more than I want anyone to accuse Richard of it. It was certainly a highly plausible thing. There were other stories about what happened to the princes, that they were smuggled abroad, which is even said by Polydore Virgil. They were going on for years. Of course, there were rumours that the boys had been killed at the time, but Henry Tudor, when he became king, was just as much plagued by rumours that the boys were alive as Richard had been plagued by rumours that they were dead.
He had to face Lambert Simnel,
Perkin Warbeck. Perkin Warbeck was accepted as the younger prince by most of the states of Europe. The King of Scotland gave him his cousin to marry.
But then can I come back to the conversation between Buckingham and Morton? Because Buckingham is, virtually speaking, hot foot from London. Was the conversation between those two, as reported by the chronicles, let us start an uprising to free the princes, or was it, let us start an uprising to put Henry Tudor on the throne?
Well, the idea that Buckingham wanted to see Tudor on the throne is, I think, a total illusion. Buckingham was going for the throne himself.
It would have been a tremendous step for Buckingham to take, would it not? Richard still being alive, just been crowned, for him suddenly, apparently without the knowledge of King Richard, according to your theory, to have killed the princes.
Buckingham was the impresario, the stage manager of Richard's accession to the throne.
That may be.
And he probably saw himself as a Warwick the Kingmaker. And Warwick the Kingmaker, of course, changed sides when the particular king didn't suit him.
Well,
So can I come on to the events subsequently? Because in the February-March 1484, the Queen released the daughters, including Elizabeth, whom Henry Tudor had undertaken to marry by then, into the power of Richard. What's your view about that?
Well, if the Woodvilles thought that Richard had killed the boys, their behaviour really becomes quite inexplicable. Not only does Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother, release all the girls into Richard's power, she sends for her son Dorset, by a previous marriage, to come home, to leave Henry Tudor and come and join Richard. And then later on, of course, she and Elizabeth York, her younger daughter, plan a marriage with Richard, and there is a surviving reference to a letter from Elizabeth York, the boy's sister, saying that she is Richard's in heart and in body and in soul. And the idea that she would have written those sort of things about someone who'd murdered her brothers is, I think, unthinkable.
Well, then I'm going to ask about 5 other very short matters. Once Henry VII had defeated Richard at Bosworth and assumed the throne himself, is there any evidence that he made any kind of inquiry about the prince's death?
Henry.
Yes.
I mean, one of the extraordinary things to me is that there is no direct contemporary accusation of Richard as the murderer of the princes. Now, Henry Tudor's Act of Attainder against Richard III, when he became king as Henry VII, mentions the phrase, the shedding of infants' blood, which obviously refers to the princes. But it is a general accusation, and what Henry Tudor needed at that moment was 2 little bodies and a requiem mass, and bury the princes, bury any thought of pretenders. He never produced them. He never produced a story of what had happened to the princes. To back up this vague charge, it took him 17 years for a framed confession by Tyrrell, who had remained as captain of one of the castles guarding Calais for 17 years, serving Henry Tudor. He was lured onto a battleship in Calais harbour under promise of a safe conduct. He was put in the Tower and he was executed for treason, conspiring with the current Yorkist pretender,
Now, I'm going to
Earl of
stop
Suffolk.
you, if I may, please. Is there any record to be found of that confession anywhere?
There is no record at all. It was not publicised by Henry Tudor. We only know of it from Moore. It was despised by Henry Tudor's official historian, Polydore Virgil.
One of the matters that Mr. Russell referred to in opening was Richard's silence, that he never produced the bodies, never produced the children, never denied or made any statement about them himself. What do you say about that?
Well, there could have been a number of reasons for that.
Yes.
One of them might have been that he despised the rumours, that it was beneath him to take any notice of them. Another might have been that he thought that he would confuse his enemies more if they didn't know whether the boys were alive and dead. And in particular, he wouldn't wish to display them so that people wouldn't know their whereabouts. If Buckingham had killed the princes, of course, he didn't have them to display.
Would given his role and his protection of them, would any denial that he made have been acceptable?
No, his enemies, of course, wouldn't have believed him. And I think even deeper than that, if Buckingham had killed them while they were under Richard's protection, he would have felt extremely guilty. I mean, he would have felt responsible for their deaths. They were under his protection and someone had killed them.